HP Lion Pride PT7. The first week of class passed in a blur for the 6th year Hogwarts students. The homework their teachers assigned them was significantly more than they had yet received in their entire school careers, and already some people were falling behind. Nearly every class ended with a collective groan from students as they received their assignments. Daphne and Tracy were thankfully not among those unfortunate students who had become overwhelmed by homework. They had diligently used every free period given them to use the library and write out every one of their essays, and even to practice the new spells. Having already learned to do everything non-verbally, that summer had given them a slight advantage over the rest of the 6th years, with exception to their 3 Gryffindor friends. So, at a bit past 8 on Friday evening, Tracy and Daphne were sequestered in a quiet corner of the Slytherin common room finishing the last bit of homework they had been assigned for the week. And that is Transfiguration finished, Daphne said emphatically, placing the final period on her essay. I think that's it. Now what are you going to do the rest of the weekend? Tracy asked, slightly bitter. Her mood had not improved over the week. Daphne was starting to really worry about her best friend. She had heard Tracy crying a couple of times during the week, when she thought everyone was asleep. Daphne simply couldn't think of anything that might help lift her friend out of her misery. Trace, I wish there was something I could do to make things better. Why don't we hang out this weekend? Just the 2 of us. We can look up interesting spells, see if we can get a unicorn to come out of the forest. No. We can use the room of requirement and see what it can do. We talked about it most of last year. What about Harry? Tracy asked, looking a bit hopeful. Her tone was still grim, but her eyes had a bit of their familiar sparkle back. He'll understand. He's been worried about you anyway. I haven't told him anything, but he keeps asking if you're all right. Besides, he's got his lesson tonight, and Quidditch tryouts tomorrow. I'm sure he'll be fine, Daphne said, waving off Tracy's concern. And what about you? How are you going to manage without one single smooch from Loverboy? Tracy's tone was still sullen, but her eyes lit up a bit at her jab. Why wouldn't you want to use the room to create the perfect lover's getaway? A truly inspired idea, that I will file away for later use, but you're my best friend. Right now, you need me, and I want to help you. Tracy smiled lightly and gave a small nod to her best friend. Hey. Daphne's younger sister said jovially as she sat herself down next to Daphne. Is it me, or have you two noticed how tense the mood is in the house? I mean, it's like there's this silent war going on. And what's really weird is that Draco Malfoy has been so non-existent. I mean, he should have given at least 2 speeches by now, telling us how we should all do what we could to get rid of those stupid Gryffindors. But, I haven't even seen him since the train. It's really bizarre, and I'm having a hard time not starting a party or something. So, what are the 2 of you doing tucked away in a corner of the common room on a Friday night when you should both be out snogging the brains out of your men? Astoria grinned like a Cheshire cat. Why are you so interested in my love life? Daphne asked, her irritation rising. Don't you have boys of your own age you could be flirting with, or something? Conceited much? Astoria asked in disgust. I'm just as interested in Tracy's love life. I thought for sure she and Blaze would be an item now, instead of him slobbering all over Tabitha Bowl. What makes you think I even like him? Tracy asked. Astoria rolled her eyes. You were practically drooling over him during all the meetings. You laughed at every one of his stupid jokes, and you took every opportunity to touch him that you could. I thought it was pretty clear. So did everyone else. Everyone else. Tracy hissed loudly. A quick glance showed her no one was listening to them, and she turned back to Astoria. What do you mean, everyone else? The rest of the Susan Bones, the Pottils, that Lavender girl, Hannah Abbott, Luna, even the Creevy brothers noticed and their boys. They even asked me if you were going out. I told them you weren't, but I thought for sure you'd try and get him this year. Had he already asked out Tabitha when you asked him? Are you sure they're dating, and not just snogging, or something else? Tracy asked, her face flushing, as she began to shake. Daphne reached out and clutched her shoulder comfortingly. Not the way she tells it. She was talking to Seraphim Visey about how nice it's been and how gentlemanly Blaze is, and what a great kisser, and all that. She said it's been the best week of her life, and how she still couldn't believe he'd asked her out. But, he told me he said. Tracy began to cry, looking between Daphne and Astoria. Oh gods, what did I do? Tori, get our stuff please. Daphne asked, gathering Tracy and hurrying her to the girls' dorm before everyone saw her burst into tears. Astoria nodded, and began gathering her sister and Tracy's things and then followed them into the sixth-year girls' dorm. By the time she got there, Tracy was sobbing fully as she was rocked by Daphne. He said that he didn't want a girlfriend. Tracy groaned. She clutched Daphne's robes to keep from falling over in her despair. Did she ask him out? Astoria asked, starting to look angry. It's a bit more complicated, Tori. Don't worry about it, please. Daphne pleaded with her younger sister, who for once, nodded, and remained quiet. What did I do? I'm so stupid. I can't believe I let him. I should have stopped it. Tracy moaned into Daphne's shoulder. No. Now we've been over this. You made a mistake. He used you. He's the one who should feel bad, not you. It's time you stopped feeling guilty over it. You wanted something from him, and he took advantage of that. I thought I wanted him to. But I thought we'd be together afterward. Why did he use me like that? What's wrong with me? Tracy howled. Astoria gave a soft "oh," and her hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Daphne glanced up again and saw the expression of compassion on her younger sister's face. Astoria was pretty good at piecing together things from very few facts, and usually came very close to the real truth. Daphne often wondered why her sister hadn't ended up in Ravenclaw, and then Astoria would do something, usually at her expense, that would show why Astoria was truly a Slytherin. I'll kill him. Astoria said, her voice low, her eyes narrowed. I'll find the very worst curse I can and test it on him. I'll put everlasting boils on his bits. Not really helping, Tori. Though I appreciate the thoughts. Daphne smiled, and Astoria simply shook her head. While they weren't close by any stretch of the imagination, Astoria was protective of Tracy, whom she considered family. I need to talk to him. Tracy said, sitting up. I need to know why we couldn't. No. Astoria said, vehemently shaking her head. You don't own that festering pile of acromantula droppings, a god's damned thing. He should be on his knees pleading for the opportunity to lick the dirt off your shoes. She's right. Daphne agreed, trying not to chuckle at the image of the aristocratic-looking Blaze on his knees licking Tracy's very muddy shoes. No, I appreciate that you both want to support me, but I have to know. If I don't, it's going to drive me insane. I have to know. Well, do me a favor. Daphne asked. Wait until tomorrow. You're in no shape to talk to him right now. Sleep on it, and if in the morning you still feel the same, I'll help you find the bastard, all right. Tracy thought it over for a moment, and sagged a bit before nodding. Daphne made good sense. If she went to face Blaise now, she'd become more emotional than she was already, and that wouldn't accomplish anything. He would likely not even talk to her if she were a blubbering mess. Boys just couldn't handle that sort of thing. "I'm going to get ready for bed," she said, sniffling, and then heading off to the bathroom. "If he hurts her anymore, I'll make it my personal mission to cause him severe pain and make him lose the use of his wand for good." Astoria scowled as she started to leave. "Maybe make it to where he pees acid or something." Daphne couldn't help but laugh at her sister's indignation, as she felt just as angry. Unfortunately, Daphne knew it was truly Tracy's problem, and as such it was up to Tracy to handle it. Daphne just hoped that her best friend would stop feeling sorry for herself and get mad at the person who was truly at fault. Maybe after she spoke to him about it the next day. Another little smile formed on Daphne's lips. An angry Tracy was a fun Tracy, so long as you weren't the target of her anger. Harry Potter was practically skipping towards the headmaster's office. Not only had he managed to keep on top of his immense pile of homework, with more than a little help from Hermione and Daphne, but he'd gotten through the week without a detention from Snape. Or even a pissing match with Draco Malfoy. So far as Harry was concerned, it had been a truly great week. Tomorrow held the promise of Quidditch tryouts, which Harry was looking forward to. Katie Bell, Cormac McLaggen, and Ginny had all asked him what he'd planned, and each had told them they were ready to try out for him. Harry had almost waved it off until Katie told him not to assume they were the best possible people for the team simply because they had played the year before. Harry saw the wisdom in her words, and agreed that all former members would try out just the same as anyone else. But best of all, tonight was to be his first lesson with Professor Dumbledore. The headmaster had spent most of the summer educating him and his friends on their enemy, Lord Voldemort, and now he felt had a very good understanding of the Dark Wizard. All he needed was a better spell repertoire in order to meet the Dark Lord in combat, and hopefully end his reign of terror, as well as his life. "Ah, come in, Harry. Right on time." Dumbledore smiled as Harry entered the headmaster's office. "Please have a seat. How has your first week been?" "Good, sir. I've been told that you've been assisting Hagrid with a few of his classes." Yeah." Harry gave a small smile. "I felt a little bad that I didn't take his class. And once again you show what an upstanding individual you have become." Dumbledore smiled, rising from his seat. "And things between you and Miss Greengrass?" Harry felt a bit of a bush creep up his cheeks. "They're good. I only wish we had a bit of time to spend together where we weren't training of anything like that." "I understand. It's important to have a bit of time to just be young and in love. I will try my best to allow you both that time. However, it will be difficult as we have quite a task ahead of us." "Sir, have you managed to locate any more of his Horcruxes?" Dumbledore shook his head. "I am afraid not. I feel I am close, but I have yet to discover any more since I found the ring. I am almost sure there is one here in the school, but as you are no doubt aware, it is a very big castle, and even I don't know all of its secrets. Perhaps I could help." "You have enough to be getting on with at the moment, I'm afraid." Dumbledore smiled kindly. "Tonight, Harry, I would like for you to take a walk with me." Harry stood and followed the headmaster out of his office. They did not speak again until they were in the hallway and moving towards the grounds. "So what will I be learning, sir?" Harry asked, barely containing his anticipation. "Something I feel will be an indispensable skill for you in the future. A skill used mostly by professional curse breakers." "Warding?" Harry asked curiously. Dumbledore began to chuckle. "Very close, Harry. I wish to teach you how to detect residual magic. I don't understand. Why would I need that? Harry asked, a bit disappointed. Harry, the ability to feel magic would help you a great deal. You will not only be able to tell if something is cursed, but what spells or enchantments are placed upon that item, or place. You mean I'll be able to tell if I'm about to get hurt, or walk into a trap? Precisely. Dumbledore smiled. However, it would be most difficult to teach you within the castle, as it is constantly humming with magic. With so many students performing spells all the time, you would go quite mad trying to discern individual magic in all that muck. So where are we going? Harry asked as they stepped out onto the grounds. The Shrieking Shack will be our classroom for this evening. Dumbledore smiled. The two companions walked down to the front gates of the school, and down the path to Hogsmeade. When they were a few hundred feet from the Hogwarts gates, Dumbledore offered his arm. I think it would be a waste of our precious time to walk the entire way. Dumbledore smiled. Harry took the elder man's arm, wincing at what he knew was coming. They approached into what should have been the sitting room of the Shrieking Shack, and Harry wobbled on his feet for a moment. Perhaps next time we could just ride brooms here, Harry said. Dumbledore grinned. I assure you, Harry, you will get used to it in time. It is much better when you apparate yourself. In fact, there will be lessons offered later in the year. I recommend that you sign up. Apparating, while uncomfortable, is a very good skill to have under your belt. You never know when you might need to pop away. Harry couldn't help but smile, and once his head stopped spinning, he stood straight and waited for the headmaster to begin. Earlier today, I placed a ward on one of the doors in this house. I would like you to figure out which one it is. Harry looked a little confused, and Dumbledore smiled. Ah, yes. Dumbledore chuckled. You're asking yourself just how you are supposed to do that, am I correct? Harry just nodded, a smile appearing on his face as he watched Dumbledore continued laughing. That is truly the point of this exercise. It will not be easy, but as you've become quite adept at occlumency, it will be a bit easier than if you had no control over your mind. Whenever we use magic, it leaves behind faint traces of energy, and they are all unique, not only to the wizard, but to each spell as well. It is how curse breakers determine what they need to do in order to break down wards in ancient tombs. Understand? Harry nodded and Dumbledore flashed a pleased smile. Good. Now, what I'd like you to do is simply feel for the warded door. When you think you have guessed it, please identify it to me. Harry still looked unsure, but he took a deep breath, and closed his eyes, trying to calm himself. He let his breath out and opened his eyes slowly. He wasn't sure exactly what he was supposed to do. So he simply began walking about the room. Occasionally he would look at Dumbledore, whose expression remained stoic as he watched Harry. Harry brought his hands up, like he was feeling for an invisible wall, feeling really very stupid as he slowly walked about the room. He wasn't even really sure what he was supposed to be feeling for in the first place. And then it occurred to him that magic was basically energy. Energy that witches and wizards manipulated to do their will, but energy nonetheless. So that's what he was trying to sense. Energy. But how was he supposed to do that? He wasn't sure. Sir? Harry asked. Dumbledore had been watching him as he stumbled and bumbled his way around the room, a soft smile on his face. Yes, Harry. Exactly how am I supposed to find the wards? I mean, I think I'm feeling for energy, but how am I supposed to feel it? Quicker than I thought. I had believed you would simply keep searching for a bit longer before you asked. Harry slapped his forehead as Dumbledore chuckled a bit. I apologize, Harry, but you seemed so determined to figure things out on your own. I thought it would be a good lesson for you to try to remember that sometimes you have to ask for help. I got it, sir, Harry said, fighting against his own smile. He felt truly idiotic at the moment, but he did see the humor in the situation. Dumbledore reined in his mirth and stepped over to Harry. Magic always leaves traces, Harry. The smaller and more insignificant the spell, the more faint the traces are that it leaves behind. Those traces call out to us, Harry. The more in tune you are to your own core, the easier it will become to feel the presence of someone else's magic. You were not far off in your attempts to seek out the warded door earlier, but it is more than simply waving about your hands. You have to feel with your magic. It is difficult, but I'm sure that given enough practice you will be able to do it. Dumbledore nodded, and Harry knew that he needed to try again. Once again Harry closed his eyes to center himself, and instead of trying to feel anything around himself, he tried to listen to his magic. Again he started to feel a bit silly, and wondered if the headmaster was having him on. And then he felt it. At first he thought it was something else. Perhaps he was coming down with a cold or something. He felt a wave of lightheadedness. He held out his arms to steady himself as he swayed a bit. But the sensation persisted, and then it began to change. It started in his chest. A warmth that seemed to grow with each and every beat of his heart. It was almost like he could feel this warmth circulating through his veins, and it made him smile as he realized that he had felt this a few times before. That night he had cast his first corporeal patronus to save Sirius. When he'd cast the summoning charm to retrieve his broom to face the dragon. And then, the night in the graveyard when he'd seen the shadows of his parents while locked in battle with Voldemort. That was when it had been its strongest. Harry marveled at how wonderful it felt to him now. It had been too brief, or his mind had been occupied before when he'd felt it. But now, he could really appreciate it. He felt strong, like he could do anything he wanted. He felt like he could simply kick off the ground and take to the sky without his broom. A most amazing feeling, is it not? Dumbledore remarked, and Harry could only nod. The ward, if you'd be so kind, Harry. Harry shut his eyes again, focusing on the rhythmic pulsing of his magic. Using what he knew of occlumency, Harry pushed all other thoughts and feelings aside, concentrating only on the gentle pulse of his magic, committing it to sense memory. His magic hummed and Harry began to feel something else along with his magic. It was hard to describe, but it felt different than his magic. Foreign, but still welcoming. Almost at once Harry felt another soft warmth, which he immediately associated with the headmaster. Opening his eyes, Harry took a few steps forward, then closed his eyes again, centering himself again and seeking out that vibration that he knew didn't belong to him. However, such was his excitement, that he was unable to concentrate enough again to find it. Harry tried several more times, and with each failure, his confidence fell, and he found it more and more difficult to center himself. That will be enough for tonight, Harry. Dumbledore said. I suggest you find time to practice. The more you find your center, the easier it will be to call it up when you need to look for residual magics. Harry, feeling a bit dejected, took the headmaster's arm, and after a second of uncomfortableness, found himself just outside the gates of Hogwarts. Can I ask why this is so important, sir? Harry, I want to prepare you for any eventuality. Though I am doing all I can to ease your burden, I fear that I will not be around to help you through it all. Lord Voldemort is not sitting idly by and waiting for us to come to him. As of this moment, you and I are his biggest threats, and since I have many more years, and much more experience than you, I am number one on his proverbial list. Sir. Harry asked, concern in his eyes. Oh, try not to worry about me, Harry. I do not fear death, but rather, I embrace it. I am getting on in years, and when my time in this world is over, I will simply move on to the next great adventure. In the meantime, my only concern is to prepare you for what awaits you, as well as ridding the world of Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes. You don't think you're going to find them all, do you? Harry asked with a hint of sadness. You should not worry yourself on that, Harry. I believe that they will all be destroyed before you face him in the end. Harry noticed Dumbledore's evasion of the question. Of course he didn't want Harry to worry, but then why waste time teaching him how to detect wards? He knew without doubt, that he was learning to seek out Horcruxes, and the first part of that training was to seek out, and take down any curses or wards Voldemort had to keep them safe. Sir, would it be possible to go along with you when you discover the next Horcrux? Dumbledore nodded without pause. He clapped a hand on Harry's shoulder and turned to look him in the eye. I have every intention of taking you along with me for every Horcrux I discover from now on, Harry. I feel that you should be a part of it. No one deserves to be a part of his destruction more than the very person who will have to strike the final blow. I shall keep you updated of my search on our next lesson, which will take place 2 weeks from this evening. May I suggest that you use next Friday for a bit of time with Miss Greengrass? For now, you should return to your common room, and remember you are not to tell anyone about our lessons. Harry nodded, though Dumbledore did catch the look of disappointment in his young pupil's eyes. Dumbledore watched Harry make his way up the stairs, and once Harry reached the 4th floor, he turned to head to his office before going to bed himself. Daphne awoke later than normal on Saturday morning. She, along with her friends, Hermione, Tracy, Neville, and of course Harry, had resumed part of their training from the summer, and had taken to jogging around the lake every morning. They had been joined by Millicent Bulstrode, who had joined Harry on that first morning. However, just like during the summer, they had agreed to rest on the weekends. The night before, Tracy had heard that Blaise Zabini was now dating another girl in their house, and it had led to another breakdown, which Daphne had done her best to ease her friend's suffering. They had not gone to bed until very late that night, after Tracy decided she was going to speak to Blaise. Daphne had tried to warn her friend against that course of action, as she felt it would not end well, and only create more heartache for her best friend. But, Tracy was one of the most stubborn people Daphne knew. Daphne sat up in her bed, and immediately felt a slight chill in the air. The castle was always a bit on the cold side, but Daphne could tell already that they were in for an early winter. Daphne hated being cold more than anything in the world, and hated piling on layers of clothing to keep warm, even more. Daphne threw her blankets off, and wincing against what she knew was about to come, placed her bare feet on the cold stone floor. "Ah!" she hissed. After a moment, she got used to it enough to actually get out of bed, and headed to her trunk to get her necessities. A quick glance around told her she was the only one still in the dorm. After a shower, and a bit of time to get herself presentable, Daphne headed out to the common room, expecting to see Tracy waiting for her. But she wasn't there. In fact, Daphne didn't see Tracy for most of the day. Daphne went down to the Quidditch pitch, and sat with Hermione while watching Harry running the tryouts for the Gryffindor team. She couldn't help but smile at her boyfriend, who looked so happy running the candidates through their paces. Hermione was good company, and the two girls talked about classes, and their boys. Hermione cheered as Neville took to the air to try out as a chaser. According to Hermione, Neville liked Quidditch, and wanted very much to be on the team, though he was certain that he wouldn't make it, as he wasn't very good on a broom. Daphne thought that Neville flew well enough, but could see quite clearly that he was not going to make the team when compared to others who were trying out. Hermione was just happy that her boyfriend was trying. It's good for him. He needs to do things like this just to prove that he can. He's very strong, he just needs to believe it. Hermione smiled as Neville finished his run, and Harry gave him a clap on the back. When the tryouts were finished, Daphne greeted Harry outside of the locker rooms. He was looking very pleased with himself, and Daphne couldn't help smiling back at him. I take it you're pleased with your selections. Daphne grinned. Harry nodded proudly. His smile fell a bit when he saw Hermione and Neville waiting for them. Nev, look, I'm sorry but... Forget it, Harry. Neville said, holding up a hand. I knew I wasn't going to make it, but I needed to try out anyway. There's always next year. Hermione smiled, and Neville bent a bit and kissed her softly. Yeah. He shrugged. Come on, I'm starving. I didn't even eat breakfast because I was nervous. The four enjoyed a nice lunch before breaking off to spend time alone. Daphne and Harry took a stroll out to the grounds, where the sun was shining brightly. It wasn't as warm as Daphne would have liked, but it was still very nice. They talked a bit, and Daphne tried to find out what Dumbledore was teaching him. She got distracted, however, when Harry began snogging her. They returned to the Great Hall for dinner, and after a long look around, Daphne decided that it was far past time to seek out Tracy and find out what had been happening. She apologized to Harry, and after a quick kiss, Daphne headed back to the Slytherin common room. Tracy wasn't in the common room, however. Daphne found her best friend pacing angrily in the sixth-year girls' dorm. Hey, where've you been all day? Daphne asked. She began to get truly concerned when she saw the look of fury in Tracy's eyes. I'm beneath him. Tracy snarled. I'm good enough to shag on the train, but not good enough to be his girlfriend. My family is just better than the Weasleys, and no one of his status can be seen with someone like me. No, gods forbid. I take it you talked to Blaise. Yeah. Oh yeah, I talked to that complete hippogriff's arse. Tracy shouted. He said that I was basically just another pansy. Someone for the boys to get their thrills with, but not to get serious with. He compared me to Parkinson. Oi. Daphne sighed, feeling her legs get weak. She sat down heavily on her bed and watched as Tracy continued to pace back and forth, muttering incoherently. I swear that I'm going to make him beg for my forgiveness. Tracy said, suddenly turning to Daphne. Oh yeah, I'm going to make the great Blaise Zabini crawl on his hands and knees and kiss my feel, pleading with me to forgive him for his idiocy. How exactly are you going to accomplish that? Daphne asked, suddenly filled with fear as she saw Tracy's eyes blaze with anger. I wrote a letter to the Weasley twins. She smiled wickedly. I didn't tell them everything, but I think that they'll be happy to help me get a little payback. Daphne's eyes were wide with horror. She had heard enough about the Weasley twins, as well as seeing firsthand just how clever those two could be when it came to practical jokes. With those two supply Tracy with whatever she needed, and Tracy's anger, and the fact that she was a great example of Slytherin. Daphne was actually a bit afraid for Blaise. Though she had to admit she really wanted to see what was in store for the slimy bastard. I told you that you don't need to know anymore. Draco said bitterly as he glared at Vincent Crabbe, Gregory Goyle, and Theodore Nott. He had spent most of the afternoon explaining that he needed lookouts while he worked on his secret project. Come on, Draco. Nott said. Why can't you tell us any more? I've told you all you need to know. Draco growled. Why do we have to use polyjuice? Crabbe asked, his face contorted by his confusion. I already told you. Draco shook his head. It would be too suspicious if you three kept hanging out in that corridor. By using Polyjuice Potion you can pose as anyone in Slytherin, and no one would get suspicious if different people were hanging around that corridor. Why first years? Goyle asked. Why can't we use older people? I wouldn't mind being in Tabitha Bowl for a few hours. Not, Crabbe and Goyle all began chuckling. Draco merely shook his head, covering his face with his hand. Are you through? He nearly screamed. This is important. You can use anyone from our house. I don't even care. But we need to be careful, we don't want whoever you're impersonating to see themselves in the 7th floor corridor while we're doing our job. If we're caught, it will be our end. Says who? Not yelled back. All you've told us is that you have this big secret mission, but you won't tell us what it is or anything. All that would happen to us is detention for using Polyjuice. Why should we even help you at all? Draco's face flushed, and he gripped his left sleeve, ripping it up his arm and showing it to the three boys. They all gave a startled gasp as they stared at the black tattoo. As they stared, each of them swore that it moved as if it were alive beneath his skin. Do you see now? Do you simpletons understand? He marked me over the summer and he gave me a very important mission. Now if you help me, I'll make sure he knows of your loyalty. He really marked you? Crabbe asked in awe. Do you think I did this to myself? Draco snapped, holding his arm out in Crabbe's face. I have to do this, and I need you three to help me. Now, are you going to, or do I tell him when I finish how you tried to betray me, and are kind? Do I tell him you all are blood traitors? You wouldn't. Nott said, his eyes narrowing. I would, and you know I would. Draco said, his voice lowering. He was practically panting now, and his face was flushed from his anger. Nott stared into Draco's grey eyes for a long time before finally nodding slowly. Good. Now, the first thing we have to do is brew up Polyjuice Potion. I can get the ingredients, but it's going to take some time to brew it properly. In the meantime, you three can start collecting people's hairs. Make sure that one of them is one of the green grasses. Potter's Slag has something in her possession that I need. Yeah, I need it, too. Goyle guffawed. But I'm quite sure she's never going to give it up to you. Crabbe chuckled at his friend's joke. Shut up, you pervert. Draco snapped. I'm talking about that potion she got from Slughorn. Once I can get into the girls' dorms, I can get it from her trunk, and then I'll have no trouble at all doing what I need to, and then I'll get my reward. Whatever. Nott said, rolling his eyes. How long is this going to take? A month. Once we have the Polyjuice, it won't be too much longer after that. Now, I have to take this letter to the Olori so I can get what we need. Not a word of this to anyone. If anyone finds out what we're doing, expulsion will be the least of our worries. Giving one last look to his dorm mates, Draco left to send off his letter. The three boys looked at one another for a minute before Nott broke the silence. He's out of his mind. But, we all saw the mark. It was real. I've seen my dad's enough to know that Draco's was real. How do you explain that? Crabbe asked. Nott shrugged. He could have learned how to mark himself. Okay, we all know how self-important Draco likes to make himself, and when his father wasn't in prison, he could back up whatever threats he made. But, this seems a bit much for that posturing prick. I don't think he'd threaten anyone right now unless he really did have the power to back up his threat. Crabbe said, getting up from his bed and collecting his charms homework. He had been trying harder this year, as his father had promised serious punishment if he didn't bring his grades up. Not to mention how secretive he's been lately. He barely spoke on the train, and he's barely been around lately. People are talking. Goyle muttered. Who cares what those sheep think? Like any of them are really concerned about what the great Draco Malfoy is doing. Not rolled his eyes. But they are concerned about their lives. At least 6 families were exposed as supporters of you-know-who, and now everyone is pointing fingers. All of us who are loyal are having to pretend we're disgusted. Do you honestly think he'll forgive that when he takes over? For the love of Merlin, he can see into your mind and find out your deepest secrets. Half of this house will be slaughtered for being blood traitors. Crabbe looked at Nott, who looked to be considering what he had heard. He gave a sigh, and pinched the bridge of his nose. So, we spend another year following that great Ponce and suffer whatever humiliation he forces on us? My gods, he's going to be making us prance around as girls. Which I plan to take advantage of. Goyle chuckled. Think of all the hot witches we'll be able to see naked. You have a one-track mind, Goyle, and it's a little unnerving. Nott shook his head in disgust. Daphne looked up at the sound of a door slam, as did a few others who were in the common room. Draco Malfoy came from around a corner, where the boys' dormitories were, and headed for the exit. He was struggling to pull his left sleeve down, and Daphne caught a glimpse of something on the boy's arm. She sat up a bit straighter, wishing she could have seen more before the bastard had left. She wasn't completely sure of what she'd seen. It was too ridiculous to even think about, much less imagine. Draco Malfoy. That pompous posturing little Burke, a Death Eater? It was far more likely he'd used ink and drawn the mark on his arm to impress his friends. Daphne had overheard Nott and some of the others complaining about their leader when the blonde ferret wasn't around. Daphne often wondered over the years why they followed him if they hated him so much. Pansy she understood. Pansy was trying to procure a better place in society for herself. If she got her claws in Draco deep enough, he would marry her, and she would become Lady Malfoy. Well, she would have before Lucius got himself thrown into Azkaban. The family would be lucky if they had 2 galleons to rub together if the Wizengamot seized their assets, which was usually what happened. Maybe Pansy realized that, and that was why she and Draco were hardly seen together anymore. Crabbe and Goyle were simply followers. Neither of them would amount to much after school, so by aligning themselves with someone powerful, they might find themselves heading up some meaningless department in the ministry. Especially if the gold was good. And the Malfoy gold had been good. While they had it. But Nott was the one that confused Daphne the most. The Knotts were a very influential family, and very wealthy in their own right. Not only that, Theodore Nott had outshined Draco in every subject. Theodore was smart, powerful, cunning, and fairly good-looking. So, why would someone like that even bother with someone like Malfoy? It was an unanswerable mystery, especially as the only one who could answer that question wasn't revealing his secrets. Daphne sighed heavily and closed her book. She wasn't going to get any more reading done here. She stood and stretched, feeling her back muscles relaxing a bit. She headed back to the girls' dorm and opened her trunk to replace her book. As she opened it, she saw the tiny vial of golden potion that she had won from Slughorn. She had been wondering almost all week how she might use it. Some of those thoughts had involved getting Harry alone someplace and getting to know him much better than she did now. And then, when she thought about Harry, she thought about what waited for him. His destiny. The more she thought about it, the more she believed that he needed that particular potion. Sure, he was receiving training from Dumbledore, and they had all gotten very strong over the summer. In fact, Daphne was confident that if Death Eaters tried to storm the castle right now, the five of them could hold off all of Voldemort's forces by themselves. Of course, that could just be her overinflated sense of power. 2 months of hard work and training from qualified Aurors would have that effect on just about anyone. But, Harry would have to face Voldemort on his own. She would be there by his side, but it would have to be Harry, and Harry alone, to strike the final blow. If he could. Daphne had no doubt that her boyfriend was capable of it. Harry was easily the most powerful wizard she knew, and he had the potential to be even stronger than Dumbledore himself in time. But, he didn't have that time. It was very likely that Harry would face off against Voldemort sooner than any of them expected. He needed all the luck he could get, and there was Daphne, with a whole 12 hours worth of good luck right in the trunk. She could give it to him, and then he would be ready. He would face down that monster, and then he would take her in his arms and the world would be perfect. They would be married and live happily ever after. Married? Where did that come from? Daphne asked no one. They'd been together almost a full year now, or would have been if he hadn't tried to be all noble and dumped her at Ron's funeral. She loved him with all her heart, there was no doubt of that. She wanted to do things with him she'd never even spoken of. But, never once had she imagined being married to the Harry Potter. She never even imagined being married to anyone, really. Sure, she'd thought about it, of course. She was a girl, after all, but she'd never pictured it. Not really. What would their life be like? How many kids would they have? Where would they live? Closing her trunk, Daphne stood and sat on her bed, allowing herself to imagine just what life would be like with Harry as her husband. She tried to picture Harry a few years older, with a bit more stubble on his face. She laughed at the image of Harry with a rather long beard, and shook her head to clear it away. They'd have a nice house, for sure. Harry was pretty well off. But he wasn't the type to sit around the house all day. He wanted to be an Auror, though he had admitted to her that after seeing Ron die, and having his life pretty much dedicated to destroying the darkest wizard ever known, the dream had lost some of its shimmer. Daphne hoped that Harry would forget about chasing dark wizards. She worried enough about him now, and they were still in school. At least with something like Quidditch, there was far less risk of him never coming home to her. Still, she'd never try to change his mind. He had to be happy with whatever he chose to do. And when all was said and done, Harry Potter would likely be the best Auror the magical world ever saw. Their children would be beautiful, Daphne decided. How could they not be? A little boy and a little girl. 2 would be perfect, she thought. Not that she was opposed to more. In fact, she might even encourage to try for more. She shivered at the thought of lying in bed with him, his bare skin pressed against hers, warming her all over. His lips on her neck, her shoulders, her breasts. Gods, I need him. She sighed. Who? Ah! Daphne screamed, slipping off her bed and falling on the cold hard stone floor. Tracy Davis fell on her bed laughing hard. Daphne scowled at her friend in pained anger. She pulled herself up and rubbed her bruised backside, while grumbling about people not announcing themselves. Sorry, Tracy said when she got control of herself. You looked a little lost in your own world there. Where have you been? Daphne asked, her anger slipping away after hearing Tracy's laughter. Oh, just doing some research. Tracy sing-songed. Following Blaze to learn his habits. Know your enemy. Tracy said in a passable imitation of Mad-Eye Moody. He's not very vigilant. I could have hexed him a dozen times today, and he never would have known it. Of course, he probably doesn't even know how to see if someone is disillusioned. Oh, gods. Daphne shook her head. Tell me you didn't watch him in the shower. No. I've already seen it. Tracy's expression became hard, and Daphne wished she hadn't said anything. So, what did you learn? Daphne tried to change the subject. I learned that he's so arrogant that he doesn't bother locking his trunk. I also know that he and Tabitha, she said the name with disgust, have a very special unused classroom on the 4th floor. I thought about putting a permanent sticking charm on his bit so when he puts it in that horse. I get the picture. Daphne held up her hands. Look, I'm behind you on this. Just, don't get too lost in revenge. You're a really good person, and I'd hate to see you get hurt, or miss something really great, because of someone else's mistake. Tracy smiled and nodded. I've thought a lot about all of it since we got back to school. He took advantage of me, there's no doubt about that. But the fact is, I let him. If my brain and mouth had worked right on the train, and I actually talked to him, maybe none of it would have happened. He didn't do anything I didn't want him to, and the truth is. Tracy took a deep breath, and her eyes fell from her friend's face to the floor. I really liked it. All of it. It wasn't rough, or fast, or bad in any way. Not that I have any basis on which to compare, but I think for a first time, it was really good. Daphne sat next to her best friend, waiting patiently for Tracy to continue. I thought of him all summer, and I dreamt of how it was supposed to go, and I probably deluded myself into believing everything would fall into place or something. I'm just as much to blame as he is for what happened. I learned a very important lesson, and I even thought about not doing anything to him. Really? Daphne's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Yeah. And maybe if I hadn't talked to him yesterday about all of it, I wouldn't have done anything but just let it go. But now, after what he said about me, and my family status and all that garbage, he really needs to be taken down. Then, I can move on to better things. By the way, have you ever noticed how adorable Justin Finch Fletchley's dimples are? What? Fletchley? Really? Daphne asked, taken aback by the sudden flip in conversation. His dimples are really cute. Come on, it's dinner time. I'll show you. Tracy said, clasping Daphne's wrist and leading her to the great hall for dinner. Daphne couldn't help but smile as she saw her best friend return. Nothing. Lord Voldemort's rage was immeasurable as he threw another ancient tome across the room and into the fire. He'd been searching for 2 months now for the answer to the mystery surrounding his loss of power. He'd noticed it upon his return. Had he been more clear-headed, and not so focused on recalling his followers, he might have noticed it right away. It had been so very small that he'd not even been concerned with it, until 2 months ago, when he'd felt another sudden drain in his magic. Which was followed shortly after by the sudden loss of his connection to the boy's mind. There had been no further incidents, but he was concerned. He still held great amounts of power, and his followers still feared him, as did the rest of the world, but something was happening, and if he didn't find a way to stop it, Voldemort feared it could destroy him. The reason for it, he was sure, lay in the blood in his veins. The blood he took from his enemy to remake his body. The blood of Harry Potter. He had used Potter's blood in order to take advantages of the ancient protections the boy's mother had invoked by sacrificing herself to save her child. That blood was supposed to protect him as well. But now, it was clear that it was still protecting the boy by destroying the Dark Lord from the inside. Very slowly. I have to find a way to negate those cursed protections, he muttered, picking up another tome, and quickly flipping through it. The very thought of being done in by something as trivial as blood magic sickened the Dark Lord. The more he thought on the problem, the angrier he got. It was the perfect plan, and it had been justice in its rawest form. To take into himself the very power that had so nearly destroyed him was so poetic. It should have protected him as it did the boy. He could touch the boy now. Couldn't he? He had touched the boy's famous scar on the night of his return, yet, just a few months ago, he had suffered immense pain when he'd attempted to possess the boy's mind. Could he still indeed touch the boy? It didn't matter. He was going to find an answer to the riddle of this ancient blood magic, and rid himself of the Mudblood's curse. Then, he would destroy the boy before the eyes of the magical world. There would be no doubt of his power. There would be no more resistance. The magical world would kneel before him, and then he would shape his new world. He just had to keep seeking the answer. Severus Snape had a huge headache. He shut the door to his private quarters and immediately poured himself a very large brandy, and gulped it down. He poured a second glass, and then went to sit in the chair before the fire. He was now committed to being around the one person he both loathed, for what he represented, and loved for what he promised to become. Harry Potter. The boy was growing into a powerful, respectable young man, and Snape had to admit he could see what everyone else saw in the boy. He was humble, and noble. Which made hating him even more painful. Every day, since the boy had come to Hogwarts, Snape had seen it, and it frustrated him to no end. All he wanted to do was hate the boy and be done with it, but every time he saw the boy's eyes, he saw his own hate reflected back. It was not Harry's hate he saw, but his own. Snape's own hatred of James Potter, the boy who'd made his school days so awful. And the same arrogant son of a bitch that had stolen the heart of the one and only person in the whole of the world that Snape had ever cared for. Severus had loved Lily Evans beyond words since he'd first seen her when they were children. He had explained to the young red-headed girl that all the amazing things she could do was because of magic. They had been friends, despite being in separate houses at Hogwarts, and she had defended him against James Potter, and his cruel friends. And then, Severus had gone and messed it all up by listening to those idiots and their propaganda. They had accepted him when they saw just how smart he was, and how powerful he could be. They embraced him when they saw him creating his own spells. Spells he'd planned to use against Potter and Black. He wanted to give them a taste of their own medicine. He was being pulled away from Lily from the older, exciting Slytherins, while she was being enchanted by Potter. Then, he had crossed the line, and done the unforgivable. He'd screamed at her in front of nearly the entire school when she was only trying to help him. He'd called her. Snape sighed deeply as he stared into the roaring fire, and took a long sip of his glass. That day he'd destroyed any chance he would ever have at winning Fair Lily's heart. And despite her cold indifference to him for their remaining time at Hogwarts, he still loved her. He pretended not to care, but his heart betrayed him every time he saw her. It was like a stab of fiery pain through his chest. And then, she and Potter had married. The day he'd heard that news was the same day he'd devoted himself fully to his dark master. He would serve more faithfully than any other, and he would stand at his master's side when Lord Voldemort triumphed. Then he had heard the prophecy, and things changed very quickly. When Lord Voldemort decided it must be the Potter child, Snape's world flew out of control. No one would be able to save Lily from the Dark Lord. No one, save perhaps Albus Dumbledore. That was why Snape had gone and begged on his hands and knees that the leader of the light do something. He even agreed to act as a spy if only Lily would be spared. She hadn't. She had sacrificed her life for that of her child. A child, that had he only tried to be the person she had once believed him to be, could have been his own. A child that represented the very best, and the very worst of Snape's childhood. A child that might be a savior to an entire world. For 10 long years, Snape had dreaded the day in which Harry Potter would return to the magical world that was his birthright. He never forgot about the child, and had on 2 occasions nearly gone to see the boy. He never had been able to explain why he had felt the need to seek out the boy, and had thankfully talked himself out of it each time. How would he have even introduced himself? "Hello, I'm the reason you have no parents." Not to mention that the boy lived with Lily's cretin of a sister. Petunia had been cruel and snotty when they were children. Her attitude had only worsened over the years, and Snape had remembered how hurt Lily had been each year when they returned to school. So Snape built up a mental image of the boy. Before he had ever even met the boy, Snape had decided the boy would be just like his father. An arrogant, self-serving, immature little prick. As such, his own pride had gotten the better of him, and he aimed years of repressed hatred out onto the boy who had never known his father's cruelty or his pride. Harry Potter could no more have been like James, than Severus Snape could have been like Merlin. And what was worse was that the boy possessed Lily's kind, warm eyes. And when he looked at the boy the very first time, he could see Lily's disappointment. It had only made matters worse. All the hate he had held onto turned inward in that very instant. Snape realized over the next few years that he no longer hated James Potter, or Sirius Black, or anyone else anymore. He hated himself. And each and every time he saw the boy, that hate was projected onto Harry Potter. And now, Dumbledore was urging that he forgive himself, and tell the boy everything. As if by some miracle everything would just evaporate, and he could just move on. The old man's unshakable faith in the human condition and the human heart. Well, some people just could not love, or allow themselves to be loved. Not after all they had done. Some people clung to their hatred as if it were as precious as air. Snape would never let go of his hate. He would never forgive himself, and he'd be damned if he ever allowed Harry Bloody Potter the chance to forgive him for that part he played in his life. No. Snape decided he would play his part. He would remain the villain in this particular drama, and when Lord Voldemort was no more, he would die with his secrets and his hate. It was his burden alone to bear, and he didn't want anyone's pity or sorrow, or even their love. He was damned, and he wished to stay that way. Finishing the last of his second brandy, he stood to refill his glass, as his thoughts turned to what he still had to accomplish. He was going to save Draco Malfoy's soul, and take the life of the greatest wizard since Merlin himself. Albus Dumbledore was going to die at his hand. Over the last 15 years, Snape had truly come to care for the man who had proven that people can change. Snape himself was supposed to be an example of that. He had given his life to the dark, only to redeem himself by trying to save Lily Evans' life. Though he had failed, he had pledged to protect her child. But Snape couldn't even claim he'd done thing to protect the boy. In fact, he was as nearly guilty as the Dark Lord for harassment of young Harry. Maybe that was why all he ever saw in the boy's eyes was Lily's eternal disappointment and her sadness. Still, Dumbledore remained firm in his convictions, despite very obvious examples to the contrary. He trusted Severus implicitly, and would defend the man to anyone who questioned the man's loyalty, all the while keeping his darkest secret. His chest felt constricted as he thought of what he was going to have to do before the end of the year. He would cast the most unforgivable of curses and rob the man of his life. Dumbledore always smiled when the topic was brought up, and chuckled about how he would still keep his dignity at the end. As if dying, warm in his bed was such a bad way to go. Snape was even surprised at how well he had taken the news that he was being specifically targeted. Like he was relieved. Snape corked the brandy bottle without refilling his glass. His mind reeled for a moment as the realization hit him. The old man wanted to die. Dumbledore knew that he was not going to live through this war. He knew that he was losing his strength. After the battle at the Ministry last June, the old man had taken longer to recuperate than he would have a few years ago. He knew then that it was his time. He was going to make a martyr of himself. It was brilliant. Perhaps it would give others the courage they would need to fight against the Dark Lord. Dumbledore had been planning this before Voldemort had come up with the idea that Draco should attempt to kill the greatest wizard of the age. Dumbledore had simply adjusted his plans accordingly to not only save Draco's soul, but to make his death something for the forces of light to rally against. But where did that leave Snape? He would be the one to strike the final blow. He would forever be marked as the cold, sinister killer who had bided his time, waiting for the absolute perfect moment in which to kill the man who had protected him. Snape would be the Judas. Snape thought about that for a few moments, before he resigned himself to his part. Fine. He thought. Why shouldn't I reprise my role as ultimate betrayer? I did it to her, why not to Dumbledore? Let them remember me as the serpent. It is not their judgment I care about anyway. Snape sneered as he heft his empty brandy glass and hurled it into the fire where it shattered. He would do as he promised. He would kill the old man, and he would do his best to keep the boy safe until all was ready for their final confrontation. And then, when it was all over, Severus Snape would finally put an end to all of his self-hatred, and his life. Please like and subscribe.